Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. We've got a few people booked on, so we'll just give it a couple of seconds to allow people to join us. My name is Gillian Askew. We'll do proper introductions in a second, but we are together this afternoon for 45 minutes to talk about supply diversity, accessibility and inclusivity with a context really thinking about that in a procurement sense. So how can we use supplier diversity to help us progress from a procurement perspective and ultimately open up the marketplace so that public procurement opportunities are more accessible. So my name is Gillian Askew. I'm one of three co-founders and directors of an organisation called Go for Growth. We're a micro-social enterprise and we are dedicated to supporting the marketplace for sustainable growth. And that looks at how we can help you get access to resources, tools, tips, knowledge to build confidence around taking part into those opportunities that can help businesses to grow over the long term. I'm a procurement professional by trade, so this year is my 30th anniversary in procurement, split between private sector and public sector, and I've been working as a provider to the public sector for the last 13 years. And I say that only just to say that I've walked a mile in both pairs of shoes. So I've let procurements out into the marketplace and I've answered procurements as the marketplace. Some housekeeping before I hand over to my co-host today, Jason. We are recording the session today, so a copy of the recording and all of the slides that you see will be circulated. So if you do want to make some notes as we go, please feel free, but please don't feel like you have to. You can ask questions throughout the session today. So we've got the Q&A function and the chat functionality enabled in Zoom today. So please do feel free to use them. We have carved out a few minutes, about 5 minutes at the end for Q&A. So feel free to ask them as we go and we'll either come to them then or we'll save them to the end, or feel free just to leave your questions to the end. We have got one poll today in the webinars and we're using Slido for it. So to use Slido, if you've not used it before, you need some sort of smart device or access to an internet browser. You can scan a barcode or you can pop an internet web URL in and it will bring the poll up. If you haven't got either, please don't worry, we can use the chat or the Q&A functionality to answer the questions. There's just a few questions that we want to go through. So before we kick off, Jason, would you like to just say hi and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Well, good afternoon to everyone. And Gillian, thanks so much for having me on this session today. Supply diversity certainly is a passion of mine. I spent 24 years in financial services, 11 years working in investment banking for a number of technology banks, actually, and about 13 or so years working in sales, selling technology back to banks, asset managers and hedge funds. And I'll tell you what was interesting was really in my career from a sales perspective, I came across a couple of challenges that really led me to launch the Collider platform. There's a couple of things that small businesses go through, and any small business listening to this will understand that getting access to opportunities really is difficult. You know, we're making 50 or so calls a day, about 12,000 calls per year, sending hundreds of emails, having hundreds of meetings, and often getting denied access to those opportunities. And I wanted to change that for the sales professional and that SME organization. But interestingly, when you eventually get into those rooms to sell something, to sell your product, to pitch and present, there's often very little to no representation in those rooms. So if you are from a diverse background, I'm a 6'5" black male, and if you are from a diverse background, sometimes when there's no representation in those rooms, it can impact your outcomes. And so I built the Collider platform to solve those two problems, to create access to opportunity and help diverse organizations be successful.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. Thank you. It is a real pleasure actually to do this with you today. It's a topic that we have talked about many times, you and I, Jason, I know. And it's not a new topic actually, which I find, and actually before we went live on the webinar today, we were reflecting, weren't we, on a GSA supply diversity conference that we were both at a couple of years ago. And then we were saying, when are we going to turn rhetoric into action? Because actually we won't change anything without changing anything. We have to do things differently in order to get a different outcome. And I think things are starting to move maybe, but are we moving enough? And are we moving at pace enough? I mean, the answer is, for me as a professional, both a business and a procurement professional, the answer is just no. So it's such an important thing that we can't stop talking about it. but we do have to, move things on. So today, what I hope we'll be able to give those people who have joined us is some sense of things that we can do differently, either whether we're a business or whether we're in procurement. So hopefully that's what we'll do. So if we think about why we're here today, I mean, we're all human beings. I always say that procurement is a very human function. People buy from people, and our supply chains, that's what we're made up of. I know there are goods and services that we are trading, but ultimately, the big resource in all of that is people. And as humans, we have bias. We have conscious bias, we have unconscious bias. And it sort of was brought to life for me from a procurement perspective probably nearly 3 years ago now, when we did an iGov survey to 150 buyers. And one of the questions we asked was, do you have any preferences of who you deal with? And out of 150 buyers, 28% very honestly said, we prefer to work with people we've worked with before. And I guess that's around there's some surety of knowledge that if they did a good job, they'll keep doing a good job. But 31% also said, very honestly, actually, we prefer to deal with brands that we know.
Yeah.
Because we feel like there's some sort of encouragement in there. And that, although the public procurement process is enshrined in fairness and transparency, if we're taking those biases into how we're designing that procurement, then fundamentally they might flow through. And I wonder just what you thought about that stuff around, some of those biases that procurement can take into a procurement competition.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as you said, the public sector procurement is built around transparency, but as people do buy from people, we all have inherent biases. Um, it'd be interesting actually to ask if we could ask your audience very briefly around biases, right? So the story goes, there's a father and son who are on their way to a football match. Now, en route to that football match, they're involved in a really bad accident and the father dies. Unfortunately, the son is then rushed to A&E, and on the operating table, the surgeon walks in and says, I cannot operate on that boy. That boy is my son. The question is, who is the surgeon? So I'll give the audience just some time to kind of think about that very briefly. But as they contemplate the answer and settle on the answer, most people say, I would go as far as say 96, 97% would say, well, the dad didn't die, or it's the gay dad, or the granddad, or the dad's dad, or some equivalent of dad. Actually, it's the mother.
Yeah.
So the reason why people get it wrong is because we don't see women as being surgeons, right? And so from that perspective, when you talk about supply diversity, the real change that happens during the change management programs is not to focus on prejudice in terms of discrimination. It's not about a right racist conversation or sexism or homophobia. We all have inherent biases that impact people's outcomes. And
Yeah.
so when people realize that actually, but why didn't I think about the mother? We've been conditioned for a long time to not see women as surgeons, to not see women as pilots. You could be someone who's disabled, right? When we look at the categories that cover supply diversity, and I think we'll cover that later, you can be disabled and go in to build a construction project and experience bias because disabled people can't build buildings. And so supply diversity is all about trying to help improve accesses to opportunities where people are marginalized. And so I think that it's imperative because there are technically five real core benefits, really. And that focuses on diversity will drive innovation for the most part. Okay. And then if we focus on just the two, where a business is open to and demonstrates representation,
Mm.
well, they can get market share gain as well because they attract new customers, they keep loyal customers, and they can grow the business from that perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's such a powerful visualization of that. So I'd not heard it before today when you mentioned it to me, and my response was, "Wow, okay, I would not have gone there straight away. It must
Yeah.
be there." And I would tell you that try and work really hard on those biases, but there is that conditioning, that societal norm, and interestingly, we were talking, weren't we? So the head of MI6. The new
Yes.
MI6 from autumn will be a woman for the first time in its 116 years heritage. So I think there is something really powerful about that. And
Yeah.
I think if we, so last time at that conference that we were together, we were talking about how do we measure supplier diversity? So there is this fatally flawed metric at the minute, isn't there, of you have to have 51% of your leadership team to be female, to be classed as a female-led business. You have to have 51% of your team must be LGBTQ plus, whatever. That metric has always been to my mind, and I think you've talked about this quite openly, just
Yeah.
fatally flawed. What should it look like, and how do we get there? How can we move that dial about it?
Yeah, so let's just quickly cover what is a diverse supplier, right? In terms of the categories, the identities that are considered to be a diverse supplier. First of all, what you have is a business which is either owned and operated by ethnic minorities,
Yeah,
women-owned businesses, LGBTQ plus, neurodivergent, and disabled and veterans. Those are the six categories that are considered to be marginalized communities that would fall under the umbrella of diverse suppliers. You
yeah,
can add SMEs in there as well. You can add um, social enterprises as well. But in terms of percentages, what happened in the US, and this goes back about 60 to 80, about 60 years ago, is that the definition of supply diversity was focused on the percent ownership of a business, which was 51%.
yeah,
Now, I'm a black male, my wife is a white woman. If we owned the company 50-50, we wouldn't be considered a diverse supplier. So I think that's a massive problem and an
yeah,
opportunity missed for many diverse owned organizations who actually required help and access to the tools and resources that could have supported their growth. And
yeah.
I've spoken a lot about changing that metric to be considered at 50% at least, because you want to be able to say you own or control a majority of a business to have it be considered to be that diverse.
Yeah. And actually, so case in point, so one of my consultancy businesses, exactly the same, 50-50 ownership with my husband. And I actually changed it to 51-49 to be recognized as a female-led business so that I could get access to those support mechanisms,
Yes.
and that network that would help me. Because actually, and I don't mean a disservice to Steve, but he doesn't do anything in that consultancy business. So, from a work perspective, it's 100% female led.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was unable to access some of those things. And
But
what's going on with under the US regime of diversity? Almost, well, I think abandonment is probably the right word.
yeah.
Does that create new issues for us or new opportunities, or a bit of both, Jason, in your view?
So supply diversity was born out of the US, right? Out of affirmative action, and back in the 60s, um, the civil rights movement and affirmative action were programs that gave birth to diverse campaigns such as supply diversity programs. What you've had happen recently since January when President Trump was inaugurated was he executed Executive Order 14151, which ultimately sunsets diversity, equity, and inclusion. So all these US organizations that used to focus on, invest in, have programs focused on diversity and inclusion have all been sunset across the US. We've seen massive impacts across the US supply chain where they no longer focus on diversity. Businesses like, to name a few, have gone for UK contracts, and because they don't meet the threshold of having some form of diversity inclusion program, they have lost access to those government tender bids who have a mandate to ensure that their suppliers are actually being diverse and inclusive in their HR programs and their supply diversity programs. So
Yeah,
unfortunately, due to the sunset of diversity and inclusion in the US, as well as affirmative action in the US as well, due to the Supreme Court ruling that happened about 18 months ago, what we're now seeing in the UK is a great opportunity, and we wrote a white paper about this. We've called it Supply Diversity, the Masters of Our Own Universe, and I'd love to share the link with you and your audience later. But we talk about the opportunity that now rests in the hands and responsibilities of the UK and Europe and the rest of the world, where we can now define ourselves what supply diversity looks like, what it should feel like, who should have access to opportunities based on marginalization in society. Should someone who's come out of prison, for example, who often doesn't necessarily experience warm, open arms as such, should they be considered to be a community which experiences marginalization as well?
Yeah.
So the UK and Europe and the rest of the world have a chance now to make supply diversity more equitable, more inclusive, and more beneficial. But bear in mind, and just to be very clear, um, supply diversity is all about access to opportunity. Your diversity grants you access, but
Yeah.
your competency is
Yeah.
what's going to actually going to get you the award. So businesses still have to continue to be great. They have to still be able drive and innovate and create great products and deliver a superior customer service. Diversity will get you through the door, but your competency is what's going to get you awarded those opportunities in both public and private sector.
And I think, it's very much the meritocracy sort of conversation, isn't it? So be awarded on your merit. So actually, but in order to be at the table, what you're talking about is so the door is open,
Yeah.
walk through it, and then when you get there, you'll be judged on your merit. And that is
Right.
the way it should be, right? But the door at the minute feels closed before you even get to the table. And that's what we're talking about. We need to open that door and
Yeah.
then judge organizations on their merit. But if the door is closed, then we're going to miss out on so much talent. And I think one of the great benefits of Go for Growth is I get to talk to so many talented organizations who need that door to be open because I always have said that procurement can change the world, and I genuinely believe it. But in procurement, we've got to do something to make sure that we have the right doors opened
Yeah.
so people can come through them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think procurement's interesting. I think the role has really grown to, if you think back years ago, right, maybe a couple of decades ago, human resources was called, I think, personnel. I think it was called,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And it went through an evolution where it became much more strategic in its business.
yeah,
Procurement's very similar. Because it's now responsible for ESG, environmental social governance, it sits really strategically now, where the CPO are more often than not going to be start reporting into the CEO and not to finance. So
yes.
they got a massive seat at the table and a great opportunity to really change and impact how businesses operate, how the supply chain can be more inclusive, and how equity is shared across
Yeah,
that supply chain.
yeah, no, absolutely agreed, 100%. Um, but there are some reality checks for us, aren't there? So when I talk to my procurement colleagues, and I'm not trying to do anyone a disservice because there is a lot of really good intent, I think, in public procurement. I'm talking about specifically at the minute, but this goes across both public and private sector.
Yeah.
When I talk to my colleagues about spend, there's some big numbers, and I'm thinking about MSMEs, so micro, small, and medium enterprises. How much of your money are you spending with MSMEs? Oh, 70%, Jill. And actually, if we drill down below that, well, how many are micro? How many of those are diverse suppliers? How many of them are voluntary sector organizations? Actually,
Yeah.
we get a dilution of that. Well, actually, we just know that we're measuring at this level. So we might not always know what they are. The possible is, and some of those great stats can mask actually what the reality feels like for diverse businesses. And we need to know that if we're not a master of our own destiny as an organization if we don't know what we don't know. So we've
Yeah.
to start with that baseline. It's not enough to know what our intent is. We have to know how we're following through on that intent, and are we actually doing what we say we're going to do. Frameworks can be a real red herring in public sector because being on a framework doesn't mean you're getting work through a framework. And ultimately, if you're not actually getting work, then what's the point? So we can say we've got 70% of SMEs on this framework, but actually my question is, how much business are they getting?
Yeah. Yeah.
Go Growth is on a number of frameworks, a number of dynamic purchasing systems. Are we getting work through all of them? Absolutely not. Are we getting work through any of them? No, not yet.
Yeah.
And so there's a difference in that reporting, and what I encourage my procurement colleagues to do is to not, I don't know what the diversity equivalent of greenwashing is, but it's the equivalent of that. I don't want to look at the headline. I want to look at the micro information underneath, and I want to really get into the ribs of it and understand it, because that's how we'll move forward. And we know that lots of diverse organisations are struggling to get access to those opportunities.
Yeah, so Jill, so just to talk on that very briefly then, I mean, what you've got is a lot of businesses So when you're a diverse owned organization, I sit on a number of groups, like the Federation of Small Business, for example. I run a group for them, an event for them every other month. A lot of diverse owned organizations hide the diversity because they are concerned that once their diversity is disclosed, they may then experience the bias that we talked about in the beginning. But more importantly, a lot of businesses, the way you can grant. So for those who are in procurement who are listening to this, if they are thinking about how do they launch a supply diversity program, they need to get executive sign off. That's the best way to launch your program. It's a top-down push. But what happens is a lot of businesses are unable to evidence that they've got a diversity already in their supply chain, that were already profitable this year or last year because of the diversity in their supply chain. So being able to evidence diversity actually then gives you a real strong conversational argument to have with your business that diversity works. We get access to the innovation. We do get that superior customer service experience. We are able to boost the economy through the inclusion of our programs as well. So, I mean, there's a few ways you can evidence diversity. You can perform a survey of your supply chain, for instance.
Yeah.
Um, we've actually delivered, we have an AI service where you simply give us a company's house number and we can tell you if that business is an ethnic minority owned or LGBTQ plus owned business through what we call large LLMs, large language models, uh,
Yeah.
to build the outcomes of those queries that we run. But I just want to quickly touch on something as well around that spend metric you talked about, right? Some will also say that in large organizations, 80% of their spend will go to the 20% of the suppliers, but then you get 20% of that spend through 80% of the supply chain, which basically goes into that tail spend.
Yeah.
That's really where the opportunity for growth is. It's how do we push or funnel more money and spend to that tail to shorten the top of that tail spend chart as such, and to
Yeah.
add more value, more money into those businesses that are in the tail. A
Yeah.
really good opportunity to increase
Well, and
spend.
I think so. Your question to me earlier about the Procurement Act, I think, is relevant at this point. So,
Yeah.
whilst the Procurement Act, I will always want more teeth in stuff, and it's a double-edged sword, I know. But the positive duty that the Procurement Act is driving around accessibility, openness, not just identifying barriers for smaller organisations, but removing those barriers. And that includes, I think, and we should understand in procurement, that includes diversity, supply diversity, and diverse organisations, not just smaller organisations, but thinking about that broader sense.
Yeah.
And so we can take the Act and take the principles of the Act and use it to drive us forward. And we have this threshold, don't we, in the public sector? So goods and services, £214,904, including VAT, is the threshold. In that tail, Jason, that you're talking about,
Yeah.
lots of businesses are looking for opportunities below that number.
Correct.
And so under that value, total contract value, we have got lots of creativity at our fingertips in procurement. So we can really think about how we structure those opportunities so they are really genuinely accessible and inclusive and really attract and use supplier diversity to show what the impact of that is in our buying. And the Act will help us do that. And the threshold helps us do that. So I think we've got some tools at our fingertips in procurement, in public procurement especially, and in private sector procurement, those tools already exist, so we can use them daily.
Yeah. I think, again, we said earlier that the Procurement Act 2023 is a great, should we say, lever to begin to look at things around procurement, right? It could have gone further, I think, though, Gillian.
Yeah, it could.
It
Oh,
talks a lot about, yeah, it talks a lot about SMEs. I think if it included language around diversity as well, that would have been a really, really cool place to start because it would have really given, in the US, they had legislation around minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses. There was a lot of conversation around that. It really helped to push the needle. And frankly, there probably was a lot of take-up in the US as a result of that. We stopped just short of adding the labels to the language, which I think would have made a real difference. But at the same point, grateful that there is, I guess, the commitment as such to really help to boost the economy by increasing spend with those
yeah.
SMEs. And you're spot on. If opportunities or tenders are above that threshold, SMEs tend to struggle with competing. And I think your next question on here is really, really powerful because it leads into it. If they can't compete, they can't win. And so,
Exactly. And these are questions that I use when I'm coaching procurement teams.
okay.
And I would normally do it in a quiz style, but I'll run through it for the purposes of time. But um, if we imagine how long does it take, and what on earth is an average person? I don't even know what the definition is. But if we whatever an average person is, how long does it take to write 500 words of professional content? And in this context, a bid response. Well, the answer is 1.5 hours on average for an average person to write 500 words. And so I start thinking as a procurer, if I've got 10 questions of 2,000 words word count or no limit on a word count, and that's where English is the first language. That's not if English isn't my first language.
Yeah.
How much time am I then saddling my bidders with? And if I'm a diverse organization, if I'm a smaller organization, I'm how quickly am I going to be in the walkaway point?
Yeah.
And it can cost over £3,000 for an organization to bid. Now, they're costs that we don't pass on, they're costs that we absorb, and they might be to an extent invisible costs. So if you're a micro organization, if I'm writing a bid, I'm not doing something else. The opportunity cost is, there is a physicality to that stuff and every public bid says, on your head be it. And then actually, the support for organisations, I mean, Go for Growth is supporting 20,000 businesses, but there's 5.5 million businesses in the UK. 99.2% are 0 to 49 employees of all different demographics. We're literally not even really scratching the surface yet. So what support is there out there? Because the success rate actually is still too low. It's 10%. It needs to
Yeah.
be higher. We're seeing 70% more engagement with competitions and 30% more awards, but we're only a tiny little part in Go for Growth. So we need more of that. We need to scale it. We need that support to be there so that without those win rates actually get higher to do some of that proof of concept that you talked about, Jason.
Yeah.
I'm only going to cover this super quick. The DICE philosophy is something that Go for Growth works to, and we pulled the DICE philosophy together before we actually became a commercial entity. We sat down and worked out how we wanted to work before we actually did it. And we don't talk about it often. You don't see it splashed all over our materials, but in effect, we've said, what Go for Growth is about is increasing diversity in the supply chain. So opening those doors and working with procurement organisations to open those doors so that we can support sustained growth. We'll do that through creating positive impact. So making, so that 30% increase in award business and 70% increase engagement is about the impact, the so what of it.
Yeah.
And actually about not making everybody bid experts, but giving people access when they need it to resources that are relevant and proportionate to whoever they might be, so that they actually can build that capability to be able to take part. And all of it is underpinned by evidence-based engagement. So your challenge is your challenge. So the things that you might struggle with, Jason, might be different to the things that I might struggle with. So the
Yeah.
support needs to help your business in the way that makes sense to you and the business down the road in the way that makes sense to them. And so we use evidence-based engagement, over 60,000 pieces of evidence-based engagement interventions that tell us what the support needs to look like. And actually, it wasn't massively complicated. It didn't cost a ton of money. We sat down as humans and said, what's important to us, what we're trying to achieve, and how are we going to go about it? So I
Right.
wanted to just put it in there today by way of saying, actually, you don't have to reinvent wheels here.
Yeah.
Taking rhetoric into action isn't in the too difficult space. It absolutely doesn't have to be in the too difficult space.
Yeah, I think sometimes we run risk of overcomplicating things,
Yeah.
and it isn't really that difficult. So the dice model sounds like it really like a really really great tool to use to help common sense to prevail.
Well, and it just allows us to go, have we hit them? Are we
Yeah,
going to we're going to do this thing? Where will it sit in that philosophy? Does it do those three things that we want to do? And are we doing it because it's underpinned by evidence?
yeah,
And if the answer to those things are no, then Jill's having a folly somewhere that is not actually in line with Go for Growth manifesto and what we're trying to achieve. And I wondered if you would chat us through, actually, so that's a bit about Go for Growth. Collider are doing amazing things, driving innovation and growth through diversity. What do you do that helps providers and buyers do things differently?
Well, so before we launched about 4 years ago now, so Collider was in the build maybe a year and a half prior to that whilst we were building the platform. But when we entered the market, the main challenge that corporates had and the public sector was that finding diverse suppliers was difficult. It was time consuming. There was data in all different places. Um, you have a group for the LGBTQ community called Out Britain. You got one for the minority community called MSD UK. You got the women's community called Out Britain, We Connect, sorry. And from a buyer's perspective, if they wanted to demonstrate social value, demonstrate their supply diversity program, they had to work with all these individual groups one to one, or decide to choose and prioritize one community over another. That becomes very exclusive by way of access to opportunities. What Collider did was to say, actually, we're going to build a fully inclusive platform. I often get a bit of a giggle. It's very similar to Tinder, but it's like, we're connecting buyers to suppliers, not companions as such.
Yeah.
And what we do is we have in the platform all the different diverse groups in the platform. The buyer then can post an opportunity, post a tender that if you do marketing services, irrespective of your diversity, you'll receive an announcement that there's a brand new tender opportunity in the platform. Do you want to participate? So if we think about what the measure of success is for supply diversity at its very base level, it is providing access to opportunity. What comes next is very important, which is what you said earlier, which is actually let me demonstrate the spend. But the
Yeah.
first thing is, can we demonstrate that we've been inclusive in our procurement efforts and endeavors to purchase products or services? And what Collider does is that it disseminates those opportunities to diverse suppliers. Essentially, I talk about it is that we help buyers find, identify, assess, and then invite diverse-owned businesses to tender inside 10 seconds, but irrespective of the diversity. So just to kind of wrap that part up, really, before us, it could probably take 6 to 8 weeks to run one tender that was inclusive across all the communities. Now it takes 10 seconds through the Collider platform.
Wow. I mean, that's just I almost want to take a minute just to digest that. Weeks to seconds is a
Yeah.
huge shift. I mean, it's seismic, that shift. It's massive. And so, and actually, it doesn't feel like there's not, I can't see anything else like Collider out in the marketplace doing what you're doing and the way that you're doing it. It feels like a good place for both buyers and suppliers to go and look.
But this is the thing, it's when you talk about diversity and inclusion, we represent exactly what we stand for because we think about things differently. We haven't got a big partner company behind us to support us. And so our innovation came from my individual lived experience. And that's really what supply diversity does. It opens up the the possibility of you finding a supplier that could really change how you
Yeah.
do business today and make it more profitable, more efficient, and more effective. So yeah, you're right. We are the only ones that are in the market in the UK and Europe doing this in this particular way. I'm very proud of that fact.
Well, and it gives buyers the opportunity to vote with their feet, right? To turn narrative into action. And my firm belief as I'm a career procurer. I don't even know if that's a thing, Jason, but it's all I've ever done is
It is
procurement.
now.
It is now. It's a career procurer. That's it. It's our job to go find the market. It's our job to go to the market, to develop the market, to encourage and engage the market. We need to go where the market is. And if Collider is a tool that helps me do that as
Yeah.
a procurer, then I should be embracing that for sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
Um, there are some common myths that we wanted to dispel. And just a heads up, the next slide is the Slido if anyone wants to take part with their smart devices. These are things that that are wrong, that are an untruth, they're myths, but they hold us back. I think that it's too hard to find diverse suppliers. Jason's just given a mechanism, a dead easy mechanism, and actually just brought to life how much quicker it can be to
Yeah.
access suppliers. regardless of their diversity, there aren't enough diverse suppliers. I mean, there are lots of diverse suppliers out there. So, the marketplace is a well-represented marketplace, and we should access the whole of it. One thing I hear from procurement colleagues is, but if a supplier doesn't apply for my opportunity, what can I do about it? But that's what we go back to in terms of the door has to be open in the first place. And what have you done to open the door in the first place? And really just, internalize that question. And as you say, diverse doesn't mean less qualified. In no
Absolutely.
way, shape, or form does it mean less in any context at
And
all.
I'll add on to that one as well. Doesn't mean cheaper as well. I think there's got to be a matter of respect to these small businesses that, a lot of times the founder's busy trying to make sure that they're paying their staff
Yeah.
just to make ends meet. So diversity doesn't mean, well, we're going to get a new supplier and charge and buy for less. You're actually going to get a superior customer experience because they will value your organization so much greater because they will fear losing you. And so their innovations come at a price, and I definitely encourage the procurement professionals on here to negotiate with a bit of love, a bit
Well,
of tenderness.
my husband's a sheep farmer, and I live in an agricultural community, and there's a difference between buying milk from a supermarket, where the profit margins are frankly a disgrace,
Yeah,
um, and buying milk from a farm shop or a farmer's market on a Saturday, and the same with meat, etc. Um, we we have to invest, I think, in our local economies for
yes.
all their glory, because that's how we'll get local economic regeneration. And
But Dilly, it's not for free. I mean,
no, it's not,
the
nor should
product,
it be.
yeah, the product that your husband's customers receive is superior to 15-week old milk that's been frozen somewhere. It's a much better product. So it
Yeah.
just speaks to reason that the superior product is what you can benefit from when buying local, buying small, buying diverse.
And we talk about like paying a fair price, and a fair price actually flows all the way through the supply chain.
Yeah,
Profit is not and should never be a dirty word. We can't take the shirt off everyone's back. If I don't know why we get surprised about our inability to regenerate local economies when we're not putting the money into that local economy in the way that we could. And that is all about the trading of goods and services. We
yes.
need to buy differently and better in order to do something differently and better. Okay, let's have a super quick look at this question. So if anybody wants to take part, and please don't worry if you don't want to, it's absolutely fine. But this is for us, actually. We're interested in what people think the biggest barriers are to engaging diverse players. You can tick all that applies. Let's have a look at how this works. So there are lots of options in there to take. So how many? 2, 4, 6. So if you scan the barcode, or you can pop into a browser, the slido.com, and then put the code in, it will bring it up. So we've got one vote already. You can tick any that apply. Whether you're a buyer or a supplier, it doesn't matter. What do you think the biggest barriers are to engaging diverse suppliers? Um, and it will be interesting to see what comes up actually around whether some of that leading from the front, Jason, comes through that internal resistance for change, for
Yeah.
example. But let's have a look. So we've got a few votes in. This will stay open afterwards, so you can continue voting, but let's have a little look. So 3 votes: resource pressures in procurement and/or commissioning. I mean, that comes up all the time to me. Do you know, one of the things you said, Jason, that difference between personnel and human resources, the
Yeah.
strategic nature of it. There is a real shift in procurement to be strategic, but there hasn't necessarily been a shift in the resourcing of it. So lack of diverse suppliers, don't know where to start. We've got a bit. Yeah, so there's a few things going on there. So that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Very honest. Yeah, very honest.
Yeah.
And
No,
it's what we tend to hear. So this mirrors what I hear on a weekly basis as well. So that's
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, no, okay, cool. Thank you for that. And the last couple of slides before we open up for questions. So, how do we build an inclusive procurement? If you happen to be a procurer on the call, or if you're a supplier wanting to look at bids and contracts, whether that's in public sector or private sector, they need to be open by design. It feels like a bit of a no-brainer that they need to be open by design, but they do. This isn't a compliance ticking exercise that we're after. This is a cultural shift. Use, if you're in the public sector, the regulations to your advantage. If you're in private sector, you don't have some of the constraints that the public sector regulations bring. But it starts with being open to the marketplace, committing to engagement, knowing the market, being proactive, and being committed to developing those processes that open the doors and making sure that they are fair and equitable.
Yeah.
Jason, what else would you add to that? How do we build an inclusive procurement?
Well, just very briefly, we actually developed what's called the hierarchy of supply diversity needs. Is a take on Maslow's um,
Okay.
theory, Maslow's theory on hierarchy of people.
Yeah.
And really at the base of that is opportunities. If
Yeah.
you're buying something, you've got the chance to make it accessible to someone in a diverse community to apply to. So that's really the most critical thing. And I would say evidencing that you already have diversity within your supply chain, because that's how you get the executive buy-in to
Yeah.
promote and support your project and program. Um,
Yeah.
and when you
Brilliant.
look at the measures of success, it will drive innovation, it will boost economic inclusion, it will expand actually supply chain resilience and evident and help you access new markets, which ultimately means more revenue for your business.
Yeah.
Virgin Atlantic did a great advert a few years ago where they showed representation really strongly across probably a 35, 40-second advert on TV. And you saw their profits rise after the COVID pandemic. Okay, so let's say they were at 3.5 billion sales prior to it dropped off. The advert came out, they went up to about 3.9 billion. So
Yeah.
there is a percent market share gain when representation is done well, and I just encourage everyone to consider it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. I didn't know that stat, and I think it's useful actually to see from others, from organizations, what the power of the possible is
Yeah.
and why it works.
It's a 4% market share gain is what's been calculated through research of over 10,500 people.
Wow. I mean, and 4%
Yeah,
to anybody's mind is a good shift, I
huge.
think.
Yeah,
Final thing, and I'll send this out. So we'll send a link to the white paper that Jason talked about. We'll send a link to Collider as well so people can go and have a look. But final thing, if you're in procurement, we've produced it's a 3-page free document. What can we do differently tomorrow? What actions can we take? I'll send it out with it because there are some just really easy steps that we can take. And one of the first things we'll do is what Jason's been talking about is have a look at your spend and then see what you're already doing with diverse businesses, because that helps you evidence the impact, the positive
yeah.
impact that's being created. And we'll set the narrative up for doing more of it. Um, Jason, firstly, thank you ever so much. It is
Oh,
always a pleasure to talk to you. You
I
inspire
love talking
me
about it.
daily.
Thank you so much.
No, it's wicked. Thank you. Keep doing what you're doing. I will stop sharing and I'll just see if we've got anything in our Q&A. So let's have a look. So we've got one Q&A, organisation mid-size, so 250 employees, only just recruiting a procurement job role.
Yeah.
How would you advise someone who is starting that role to begin exploring supplier diversity? Great question.
Yeah, so I'll take a quick stab at that. That individual has to have a hearts and minds approach to supply diversity anyway. It has to be more than just a job to that individual.
Yeah,
And so if you're looking at candidates, any interest that they have around D&I will be a tool that could be leveraged to help them run a supply diversity program as well. It'll be a passion for them, not a job as such. Sometimes
yeah.
we find those who have to do it as a job are less, they adopt the program less. And so you want a leader who is conscious of and committed to inclusion, both in D&I and in supply diversity.
And I think that's such an important point around, where we started at the beginning of this webinar was it's a really human function, people buy from people. So the values that we hold as individuals are really important. So I think, yeah, if this is something that matters, if this is part of your value system professionally and personally, then actually it will very naturally shine through, and it will be easier. I had a really interesting conversation actually with a procurement organization. They were part of a training course that I was running. And we were talking about the ED&I change in rhetoric
Yeah.
from the US. And an organization, they had got rid of their supplier diversity champion. And so there was a massive intake of breath, eyebrows off foreheads. And what they said was, actually, this isn't a project. This isn't something that we do in addition to procurement. It's like
Yeah.
sustainable procurement is procurement. We don't have sustainability over here, ESG over here, and procurement over here. They are one and the same function. And actually, that's what we're trying to do with diversity. We're trying to let everybody know that we procure in a way that encourages inclusivity and accessibility. We want to understand our marketplaces and who makes them up. And we
Yeah.
don't want to do that as something that feels separate from anything
Right.
else. We want to fully embed it.
And then just
Really interesting.
yeah, I guess my second part of the question is really perform or start with a baseline exercise first.
Yeah,
It doesn't need to take long. And again, there are multiple ways you can do it. Conducting a survey, um, yourself, which is a survey out to your suppliers. There are people out there who may be able to help as well. We have AI that does it for you. But when you establish your baseline, you just know where you start. You can look back and say, well, last year we spent £2 million out of £25 million with diverse and businesses. And then you want to set a target for the next year potentially, right? Do you want to
yeah,
increase your spend by numbers, by diverse suppliers? But you start with a baseline exercise, but your hiring is going to be critical that the person who you hire is fundamentally committed to
engaged. Yeah,
the process as well.
absolutely. And there was one other question, which I think you might have answered actually in that. So, what's the best way of understanding the current diversity of your supply chain? So, we've tried asking suppliers for further details. Your approach, you can do that for organizations, can't you, in Collider? So, you can, if suppliers aren't forthcoming with those polls, actually, you can help with your AI, you can help businesses understand what diversity looks like. So,
So we've seen it done wrong. Okay, here's the thing to the question. Here's what you want to avoid. Most suppliers don't understand the language around supply diversity and diversity inclusion. So you
yeah,
may have a large organization with women on the board and a female director or someone who's LGBTQ plus as a director and say that they are a D&I company. They may not be a diverse supplier. They're very
yeah,
different things. Okay, so just understanding the difference between the two. Um, and so when it comes to are your suppliers diverse, yes, Collider can support that, but ultimately you want to go out to the supply chain and actually survey them and ask them to denote what their ownership of diversity is.
yeah,
We use AI, which goes out. We use algorithmic intelligence, LLMs, and we can determine. Here's a good example quickly. I know we've got a minute left. Um, we found that our business was an ethnic minority owned business because the lady who runs the company uses black emojis in her texts and conversations on LinkedIn and elsewhere. So
yeah,
we go to that level of granularity to
yeah.
then suggest diversity, which we then can human verify.
Yeah, okay. So I think, if you want to do that baseline and you're struggling with it and you've tried to do the polls, have a chat with Jason and just see what the art of the possible is. You can have those conversations. Um, Jason, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming along. We hope that's been really useful. We'll get everything out to you probably in the next 48 hours. So hopefully by close of business on Wednesday latest. If you want to chat with us, our contact details will come out with the slide deck if that's okay as well, Jason, if anybody wants to chat to you about your algorithmic intelligence and baselining and that kind of stuff, and actually just joining Collider and getting involved a bit more. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jason. It has
Thank you so
been
much.
a
Well
pleasure
done.
to talk to you. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
See you soon.